and welcome to this week's episode of the PhD Life Coach podcast. And this is really building on an episode I did a few weeks ago about celebrating tiny wins. And if you haven't listened to that one, don't worry, this one entirely stands alone. But this is sort of the other end of the scale, right? Because I think all of us can benefit from learning to celebrate our tiny wins a lot more, those day-to-day things that we either take for granted or disregard as easy, where actually we have that opportunity to fill our lives with positive reinforcement and praise for doing the small things. But we then also have this question of what to do about the big things, what to do when we get a job, what to do when we get a paper accepted, when we get a promotion, whatever it might. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of work helping my members and other people who attend workshops that I run to identify their strengths. And one of the things that comes up over and over is that people are really worried about being too big for their boots. They're really worried that people will see them as big-headed or arrogant and conceited. And so many of them find it really difficult to identify their strengths, and many of them find it really difficult to celebrate their big wins. They somehow feel that by celebrating their wins, that means they're diminishing other people, or they're making other people feel uncomfortable, or any of those things. And so this episode is really about how can we celebrate big wins in a way that doesn't feel like we are getting too arrogant and we're making other people uncomfortable? Or how can we at least reframe that so that we're comfortable celebrating our big wins? So, one of the things I always teach my members is that when we have little anxious thoughts, not big anxious problems, but like little anxious thoughts, it's useful to put them on the table in front of us and ask us, before we do anything else, is there any truth here? Okay, so we're going to do that with this one. Is it possible that you do sometimes get a bit too big for your boots, as it were? That you do sometimes behave in a way that is perceived by general people, not by just one person, is perceived generally as a bit arrogant, a bit conceited? Is that true? Okay, now I'm going to put a rule on this. We don't count childhood. When we're kids, we're all idiots, right? When we're kids, we don't know. We almost all have probably been told at some point, oh no, don't say that or whatever. So this isn't, I don't want you traipsing up some memory from when you were 10 years old and going, oh, Mrs. Knight told me that I'd get too big for my boots. Screw Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight was my class 5 teacher. Screw Mrs. Knight. She doesn't get to live in your brain anymore. You were a kid. You were finding out what was okay, what wasn't. So we're not going to use those memories. But if in your adult life, you can genuinely think of times where people who care about you have had a quiet word and said, dude, maybe tone it down a little bit. You're kind of going on about yourself much more than you go on about other people. We're going to touch on that very briefly at the start of this episode. And the reason I'm doing it very briefly is because I don't think that's most of you. In my experience, the people who are perceived as too arrogant and conceited usually aren't the ones asking, how can I celebrate this without appearing too arrogant? They're not the ones asking it. And that means they're probably not the ones listening to this episode. The vast majority of you are probably worried about this in a kind of hypothetical, I don't want people to judge me way, but with no grounds for thinking that they actually do judge you in that direction. But let's touch on it. And when you're thinking about this, I want you to remember, this is not just somebody who feels bad because they haven't succeeded in the same way as you have, or that, you've reminded them of something they haven't done in their life. The definition of arrogant is unpleasantly proud. With overconfident, with being conceited, there is an element of dismissing other people's wins as well. So this is not just about you celebrating yours to an excessive or unpleasant amount. It's also that you dismiss other people's achievements as well. If that still feels like you, I have a few small tips. The first one is don't generalize your wins too far. And this is true for all of us, right? Is that just because you've got one paper published, it doesn't mean you're the greatest thing ever. It doesn't mean that it's going to be easy forever. It means we get to be proud of this one thing. So we get to make sure we're not generalizing too far. We need to make sure that we are Feeling and expressing gratitude for the things and the people that helped us along the way. Usually, when people are unpleasantly proud, they're sort of taking all the credit without recognizing how other people have contributed. We want to make sure that we're also celebrating other people's wins. And again, this is true for all of us. However loud we are about our own wins, we want to be that loud about other people's wins as well. And finally, if this is something that you struggle with, I want you to take some tips from this episode where we think about quiet ways of celebrating. Because sometimes if you are somebody who feels you have something to prove, you are somebody who has often been told that maybe your own self-celebration is a little bit much, it can be useful to practice some quiet celebrations, not to manage other people's emotions, but to see what that feels like. So if you feel like you genuinely actually are in danger of being a bit arrogant and self-absorbed, then those are some tips for you. But we're going to move on now, because I think for the vast majority of you, that's not the case. For the vast majority of you, this is something that you're worrying about that probably isn't based in much other than either your own brain or like the occasional comment you've got from somebody who probably had other motives anyway. So the first thing that I would remind you, which is always, always true, is that other people are allowed to have thoughts and feelings about you. If you are behaving in a way that you think is appropriate, if you are celebrating in a way that you think is appropriate and that is in line with who you want to be and comes from your best self, other people are allowed to have opinions about that. That can be hard to stomach sometimes, but it's true. Everybody isn't. You're entitled to your opinions about people. You can think that people around you should behave differently than they do. It doesn't necessarily mean that we then have the right to make them change or anything like that. So we get to remember, it's possible that by saying I'm celebrating this, somebody will get upset about it. And that's their responsibility. Okay, as long as we're comfortable that we've behaved in a way that's in line with our own personal code of ethics, our own personal ways of being, other people are allowed to have those emotions. And the reason that has to be true is sometimes us just existing can have those impacts on each other. Okay, we all know, and I agree with the kind of the sensitivities around this. We all know, companies who give you the option of opting out of Mother's Day celebrations, for example, if that's something that is really upsetting for you for whatever reason. It doesn't mean that we can't celebrate our mothers. Those of you who have had children, there will be people who will be upset when they see other people having children, having families, because that's something they weren't able to do. For those of you celebrating professional success, there will be people that will find that upsetting because it will remind them of the things that they haven't done. We can be compassionate, we can be understanding, but it doesn't mean we have to not celebrate ourselves. People are allowed to have emotions about whatever they have emotions about, and we don't have to micromanage ourselves in order to eliminate that entire possibility. Because apart from anything else, it's not possible. You just existing means that people will have opinions about it. If you never celebrate anything, people will have opinions about that too, right? There is no way of avoiding other people having emotions. So we get to check in and say, is this an okay way to behave as far as I'm concerned? And then we can just be compassionate to other people's responses to it. Now, why is it even important to celebrate? Well, I think there's a bunch of reasons it's important to celebrate. We want to make sure that we are getting a nice reward for the hard work that we put in. Now, I'm a big believer, this is why I talked about tiny wins first. I'm a big believer that we should focus on enjoying the process as well as waiting for that end goal. But we can give ourselves a lot of positive reinforcement by then celebrating that end goal. What I see in academics and PhD students so much is the second that thing has been achieved, we somehow discount it in our heads and move on to the next thing that we haven't done. And what that does is it doesn't give us any positive reinforcement for having achieved the thing that we've achieved. And if we don't get positive reinforcement, it's much, much harder to work towards these things in future. So we want to be positively reinforcing the process on a day-to-day basis by celebrating our tiny wins, but then also celebrating the actual achievements so that we get that bigger scale positive reinforcement as well. The second reason I think it's important to celebrate is so that our wins are just as memorable as our losses. I want you to think about how much time you have spent thinking about times where you failed or where you got embarrassed because you did something wrong or you didn't live up to your expectations or whatever it might be. I want you to think how much time you have spent ruminating on those experiences. I bet all of you can think back to times in your childhood, and the ones that will be very vivid that have popped into your head many, many times are the ones where something really embarrassing happened, where you were ashamed, where you were, where people were judging you, where you were getting told off. Those things live rent free in our heads so often, and we reinforce them by rehearsing them over and over again. One of the things that celebrations can do is make the wins more memorable too, so that when we're feeling a bit nervous, we also have vivid memories of times that we've celebrated. Celebrations also give us the opportunity to learn from our experiences. And I'm going to tell you more about that in a second when I give you some ideas about how we can celebrate. But when we just move on quickly past our wins without truly celebrating them, without truly analysing them, we often miss the opportunity for a lot of learning and self-improvement as well. Finally, I don't want you to underestimate the extent to which you can serve as inspiration or example to others. So, for everybody who sees your win and goes, "Oh no, I've never achieved anything like that. I feel bad about myself now because they celebrated their win." There's somebody else going, "Oh, is that possible? Is that possible for someone like me?" And this is true for everyone, right? But it's particularly true if you come from demographics that are traditionally underrepresented in academia. Every time you see somebody who looks a bit like you or comes across a bit like you achieve something, you get to go, "Oh, this is something that's an option for me. This is something that could happen. Somebody else who looks a bit like me or sounds a bit like me or experiences a bit like me has done these things. Maybe I could do this too." Now, I'm going to give you an example there. And this is a combination of tiny wins and celebrating success. So when I was a academic, you have all these sort of admin leadership service type jobs. And one of the ones that I had for quite a long time was a sort of welfare tutor. Now, this was back in the day, right? This was way before the university had kind of minor counselling services, but beyond that, there really wasn't the focus on well-being that there is now. And so a lot of that really fell on academics. And I took my jobs welfare tutor probably a bit too well, but anyway, that's a story for another day. And we're also personal tutors. So we have people who don't necessarily have problems, but they're allocated to us throughout their undergraduate degrees, and we're like their first point of pastoral care. Anyway, so I was welfare tutor, I was personal tutor, and that meant I got thank you cards, right? And I loved my thank you cards because frankly, I am not organised enough to ever write. I write thank you cards for my Christmas presents. Thanks, Mum. I definitely do that. But beyond that, I rarely get round to it. So if anybody ever thinks to send me a thank you card, I absolutely love it. And they used to say really lovely things. And so I used to stick them on my wall. And I didn't stick them on my wall to show off. Some people may have thought that I was saying, "Oh, look, the students love me." I stuck them on my wall because when I was having bad days, I would notice them and I would remember why I do what I do. So it was very much positive reinforcement of tiny wins for me. I'm sure some people had opinions about it, but I knew that I benefited from it. And I knew that some people probably had opinions about it, that I was trying to demonstrate how popular I was with the students. That's fine, they can have opinions. But the bit I had underestimated until somebody said it to me was the extent to which they also served as inspiration for my students. So I had a gorgeous personal tutee who I loved. She was a really, really lovely girl. And she didn't have many particular problems as we went through and stuff, but she was good at turning up for her personal tutorials, which anyone who's a personal tutor will know that's not necessarily expected. So I knew her reasonably well. Anyway, when she was ready to graduate and it was her final personal tutor meeting of her degree program, she came to see me and she'd got a card. And that was really, really lovely. And she said to me, "I remember coming in here for my very first personal tutor meeting and I looked at all those cards and the first thing I thought was that I'm going to be well looked after, because if all these students are saying thank you, then I'm going to be well looked after. And the second thing I thought was that I can't believe in 3 years' time, I'm going to be giving her a thank you card having done my degree. It feels like such a big thing. I can't believe I'm going to get there. But seeing those cards reminded me that I will. And she said, and every time I come from my personal tutorials, I look at the cards and I think I'm going to give you a thank you card when I finished my degree. And it became her, like, it was her symbol that she was going to get there. And I had no idea. They had never been put up with that intention. But that little mini celebration of myself, that little mini, I'm proud of the impact I've had, that little mini, I want to remind myself of this when things are tough, was also, unbeknownst to me, acting as inspiration for somebody else. And anytime you celebrate anything, that is also true. So if I've sold you on that it might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but there might be benefits from it, what are ways that we can celebrate without this sense that we're bragging about ourselves? So the first question I want to ask you is, what would be a really you way to celebrate? Now, you might be going, the you way to do it would be not celebrating. But if we look at you and the things that make you different, the things that make you interesting, the things that make you you, what might be a really you way to celebrate? As an example, I was celebrating a good launch last summer. I went for a flying trapeze lesson. I can't think of anything more me than going for a flying trapeze lesson. It's something that people go, what? Really? At your age? About? It's something I'm not. I say I'm okay at it. I'm okay at flying trapeze compared to the population. I am not okay at flying trapeze compared to flying trapeze people. But compared to most people, I've done it a few times. I can vaguely do it. If people want me to, you have to reply to my emails and tell me you want this. If you want me to, I will post a video on Instagram at some point and you can see my best catches. Anyway, I booked that. That was a very me thing to do. That is probably not a very you thing to do. Although if it is, I recommend it. It's incredible. So what would be a very you way to celebrate? Are you a crafter? Could you make something to commemorate your success? Could you, do a little embroidery or make a piece of art or something like that? I also did that. I don't even know where it is now, actually, which is bad. I'm looking around my office madly. I made a piece of art to celebrate the people that entered my very first round of the quarterly membership. So I did that as a little mini celebration because I love craft too. What could be things that just make you stay in that moment a little bit longer and commemorate it in some way, so that you're sort of spending more time on it at the time, and so that it's something that you think about more regularly than you would if you haven't got something that exists like that. And the nice thing is, it can be different every time. I tend to do something different every time because, my brain. But you might find that you want to be somebody who has a little tradition, that maybe you do a little mini cross stitch every time you get a paper published, or you add a crochet tile to a blanket every time you get a paper published or something. They might have to be quite big because otherwise that's going to take a while to make a blanket unless you're a genius. But you get my point, right? You can set up little traditions where you do something like that. I've seen people get their abstracts printed onto mugs and things like that, so that they remember when they got their first paper published, for example. Could you start or continue some sort of collection? So if they're, I don't know, buy yourself a little Lego figure for every time you get a new paper or each time you get an achievement of some description. I hadn't even thought about this as celebration, but it's totally true. I have a whole row of champagne bottles in my lounge. People always think I'm an absolute alcoholic, but they represent many different achievements generally in my life. So I've got one from when I got my undergrad degree. I've got one from when I got my PhD. I've got a couple from two different PhD students. So my first PhD student and then another PhD student bought me a bottle of champagne, so I'm going to keep it. I've got it from when I got my professorship. That was a little tiny one because it was during the pandemic, and so I was on my own, and one of my best friends came and put it on my doorstep and then retreated an appropriate distance with a party popper. So that was a mini one, and so I always remember that one's my professorial one because I drank it on my own. Could you start little mini collections of something that you only get when you've got some sort of big achievement? And these don't have to be big, expensive things, right? In fact, often it being something little that kind of accumulates over time can be a really nice way of doing it. Essentially, what we're trying to do is use celebrate as the verb that means to recognize and make special. It doesn't have to be shouting about it to other people. If you find the idea of telling other people really uncomfortable, then, I think we should probably coach on that. But we can start from these kind of quiet personal celebrations. The other thing is they can be a route to sharing, right? Because it's very different. Matt, what you think you're scrolling LinkedIn and you're saying, I'm happy to announce, blah, I'm happy to announce, blah. And you're going, yeah, whatever. Anyway, or then somebody posts, I don't know, here is a cushion I made to celebrate getting promoted, whatever. It's such a different vibe, right? People are going to engage with that in a, oh, it's beautiful, you're so clever. Oh, and by the way, congrats on that. It's going to change the nature of the interaction. Now, for others of you, you might be like, I'm not crafty, I don't make things. That's okay. Let's make it memorable in other ways. So maybe you love hiking. Okay, maybe every time you get a big celebration in your life, paper published, promotion, whatever, you hike a new hill. So some new summit that you haven't been up to before. Maybe you take with you the paper. So you have a photo of yourself at the top of a hill with the paper, pointing at it, grinning like a maniac, so that you've got a memory and a photo where you're doing something very you to celebrate it. Maybe, you're a canoeist, you go to a new river every time you get published or something. Anything that makes it memorable, recognizable, where you're commemorating it in that way. Now, I also mentioned that the other really important reason to celebrate is so that we can properly learn from the experience. And this is not to take the joy out of it, right? I don't want you to be like, oh, this is a learning experience. But we dissect our fails. What should I have done beforehand to avoid this? What should I have done during it? How could I have been better? How can I be less crap next time? I want you to bring that level of forensic analysis, but I want you to bring it positively to your wins. This is something I do in the coaching sessions all the time. And I can see people get uncomfortable with it because it feels weird to talk about it. But I promise it is super, super rewarding. And that is, I want you, when you have had a paper published, when you have got promoted, anything like that, I want you to ask yourself, what strengths did I bring that enabled this to happen? If it helps you feel less uncomfortable, also express gratitude for the support that you got. But I want at least as much time on what am I grateful that I did? What strengths did I bring to this? What difficulties did I overcome in order to achieve this? What can I take from this to move forward? Okay. And I want that, what can I take from this to move forward, to be two different elements. Firstly, how can I replicate what I did? So where did I use my strengths? Where did I overcome difficulties in a way that I liked and in a way that feels sustainable so that I can replicate that? How can I basically reinforce that this is evidence that I know how to do this thing? The second bit that I want you to do, though, is I also want you to notice where you achieved this in ways that aren't how you want to achieve things in future. Because some of us are still a little bit stuck in that I achieved it, but I beat myself up. I worked hours that weren't sustainable, that I hated, that were unhealthy. I thought in unhealthy ways, etc., right? So we also get to learn from, if I achieved it in ways that aren't how I want to achieve things in future, what can I learn from those lessons? Okay? But don't go straight to that. Strengths first. Okay? Strengths first. What you're proud of first. And I want you to talk to somebody else about it, or write about it, or speak into a voice note recorder about it. Anything that really kind of emphasizes that stuff so that it really reinforces it in your mind. You then, if you have got a kind of planning and review process like the one that I teach in my membership, I want you to insert this into there. Okay, I want you to have some notes. These are strengths I used when I achieved my last thing. So these are things I want to do more often. And you can build that into your planning and review process. Finally, and I suspect most of you are a long way from this, but finally, I want to reiterate the same advice I gave the people who were actually in danger of appearing a bit arrogant, which is we try not to associate our wins with our self-worth. So what I want you to be doing, I want you to be celebrating the wins for the fun of achieving those wins, for the fact it was a challenge and you met the challenge and you made it happen. What we don't want to do is take lessons of, this is evidence I fit in academia. This is evidence I deserve to be here. This is evidence that I am a worthy person. Because the downside of that, if you use objective achievement as evidence that you are a worthy person. If you have a period of time where you have fewer objective achievements, then you're going to use that as evidence that you're not a worthy person, that you don't deserve to be in academia. You all deserve to be in academia. You are all capable of being in academia. So we want to separate those two things out so that we're super happy that this thing's happened, because isn't that fun and exciting, and it's out in the world and I'm doing my thing, yay. And yeah, it showed some of the strengths that I have, but it's not the reason I deserve to be here, and it's not the reason I'm a worthwhile person. All those things, I have intrinsic worth. I don't need to achieve things in order to have intrinsic worth. And so I want you to make sure that when you're celebrating, we're staying in the I'm celebrating this fun thing that I've put out there that I'm really proud of, not, oh, finally I'm good enough. Finally, people might believe that I'm enough. Again, if that side is something that you really, really struggle with, then that is a little bit of evidence that maybe you need some coaching and you could consider looking at the membership in the future. My final tip, and this is true for everybody, the best way to feel comfortable about celebrating yourself is to celebrate everybody else at the same volume you celebrate yourself. If we all celebrate each other's successes, if we all spend more time feeling proud of others, reminding them of their strengths, emphasizing, commemorating, making memorable their achievements, then partly it just makes it such a nicer place to be. And then it also makes it much easier to celebrate our own successes because it all just feels like the same tone, right? We are people who celebrate. So celebrate each other's successes, celebrate your own successes, and let's make academia feel like a much more fun and pleasant place to be making these achievements and making our contributions to the world. I hope that's useful. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions or want to let me know what you think, you can always reply to my newsletter. If you're not signed up, you know how to do it. Go to my website, thephdlifecoach.com. You'll find a sign up for my community button right there on the front, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you next week.